What I have to say is rather difficult to explain, particularly to young people, I feel that young people nowadays form their opinions about life too soon. One shouldn't do that. But then perhaps you're different.
Welcome to episode 14 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring coastal horrors and the terrors that lurk in the liminal space between the land and the sea. First up, we have Messiah of Evil from 1973, a surreal, almost Lovecraftian indie horror from the writers of American Graffiti, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and somewhat bizarrely, Howard the Duck. Then we jump forward to 1980 for The Fog, John Carpenter's follow-up to Halloween, starring Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Adrienne Barbeau, and Janet Leigh. Both of this week's movies depict terrors from the past, returning to menace supposedly idyllic seaside California towns. But behind the scenes, both have their roots in the rise of American independent cinema in the 1970s, and also share some very interesting and rather troubled post-production stories. Along the way, we'll also be exploring the nature of coastal horror, including just a few of my favourites of the subgenre. We'll also be discussing the death of the Hollywood studio system, the rise of independent filmmaking in the 1960s and 1970s, and much more. And just as a heads up, this is going to be another rather long episode. So before I begin, as always, I'd like to mention the main sources that I've used as reference. When discussing Messiah of Evil, I have heavily referenced the book Nightmares USA, The Untold Story of Exploitation Independence by Stephen Thrower. I've also referred to the mini-documentary Remembering Messiah of Evil, from the Code Red DVD release of the movie, and also the websites creepycatalog.com and dreadcentral.com. And when discussing The Fog, I have drawn material from the extras on the Studio Canal Blu-ray restoration release, including the documentary Retribution, uncovering John Carpenter's The Fog, and the audio commentary from John Carpenter and writer-producer Deborah Hill. I've also referred to a 1980 profile of John Carpenter that was published in The New Yorker. For people who don't live by the sea, the shore is often seen as just a place of holiday, a tourist destination that offers sun, sea, surf, and relaxation. But for those who live by the sea all year round, the shore offers a way of life, tradition, heritage, and also superstition. As the area where the land meets the sea, the shore is the ultimate liminal space, a shifting boundary that is marked by the tides and the weather and is never the same thing twice. It's a place of arrivals and departures, and as such is a place of possibility and transition, marking both journey's end and journey's beginning. In folklore and literature, these spaces are often haunted not just by ghosts, but by the memories of those who once crossed this boundary and never returned. It's a place where realities are thin, and where anything and everything might pass through. And on a physical level, the shore can also be a place of great isolation, exposure, and vulnerability. And if you don't believe me, just try standing alone on an off-season beach late at night, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Of course, the shore is a place where people make a living, and the world of the sailor and the fisherman is rich with myth and superstition. Whistling aboard a ship or setting sail on a Friday is thought to bring bad luck, and the renaming of a boat without specific ceremony was also thought to trigger misfortune, as it would anger Poseidon, the god of the ocean. There is also the superstition of the Jonah, named after the biblical character cursed by God, who brought devastation to a ship on which he was travelling. In maritime law, Jonahs include priests and clergymen due to their association with funerals, and also women, who were thought to be a distraction for the crew. Make of that what you will. And, for some unknown reason, also people with red hair. It was said that were a sailor to meet a redhead before setting sail, they must ensure that they speak to them first, before the other person speaks to them. One such Jonah character is the narrator of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which was first published in 1798, and which tells the story of a sailor who recklessly kills an albatross, and as a result brings a curse upon his ship and on himself. The crew suffer supernatural torments, the wind dies, the mariner is forced to wear the dead albatross around his neck as a punishment, and ghostly forces claim the lives of the crew. The mariner is forced to spend eternity walking the earth, and telling his tale as a cautionary warning to everyone and anyone that he meets. More seafaring horrors can be found in the works of William Hope Hodgson, a British writer who is probably best known for his novel The House on the Borderland, but who also often fused nautical adventure with supernatural and cosmic horror. A former merchant seaman who ran away to sea to be a cabin boy at age 14, he drew on his own life experiences to create vivid and authentic depictions of life on the sea, as well as the isolation and dangers of the open ocean. He combined this with early examples of cosmic and body horror, as can be seen most startlingly in his stories The Derelict and The Voice in the Night. In the story The Derelict, a ship's crew encounters an abandoned vessel adrift in the ocean, which is seemingly lifeless, but strangely overgrown with a gelatinous fungal substance, which turns out to be a new form of life, intent on ingesting the sailors. The story The Voice in the Night tells the tale of a different vessel, which encounters a man in a rowing boat asking for food, and who tells them a disturbing tale of how he and his fiancée escaped a sinking ship, and found themselves on an island in a lagoon that had been taken over by a fungus, which eventually started to grow on and then inside their bodies. They are incredibly disturbing stories, and dramatic readings of both are available on YouTube, and I'll link those in the show notes. Moving away from fungus and sailors, fishermen too had their own belief systems designed to ward off misfortune and mitigate risk, including the touching of cold iron, the purifying of boats by smoke or fire, and the blessing of fishing nets. Again, there were also Jonahs, or unlucky people, that had to be avoided, and even some animals had to be given a wide berth, including cats, pigs, rabbits and dogs, all of which could cause bad luck, which might manifest as a poor catch, technical problems at sea, or something far worse. Fishing and sailing are, of course, incredibly dangerous practices, and it is therefore completely understandable from a psychological point of view that people might seek to mitigate risk and calm their own anxieties by employing a variety of rituals, habits, traditions, and prayer. The dangers of the ocean are many, and anyone who has grown up by the sea will certainly, and unfortunately, have their own stories of local tragedy and misfortune. In the 1870s, a writer called Robert Hunt collected a series of folk tales from around the county of Cornwall, where I grew up, and which had, and still has, a large fishing community. I'd just like to read one of them to you now, and this is called The Calling of the Dead. The fishermen dread to walk at night near those parts of the shore where there may have been wrecks. The souls of the drowned sailors appear to haunt those spots, and the calling of the dead has frequently been heard. I have been told that, under certain circumstances, especially before the coming of storms, or at certain seasons, but always at night, these callings are common. Many a fisherman has declared that he has heard the voices of dead sailors hailing their own names. With fears and superstitions such as these, it's not really surprising that in the past, these anxieties and fears of the sea would often manifest as legends of sea creatures, ready to cause disaster for those who would come into close contact with them, and some of whom would occasionally also make their way onto the shore. Tales of mermaids and mermen, and not necessarily the benevolent ones that you might encounter in a Disney movie, were often found in fishing communities the world over. In Scotland, the Blue Men of the Minch, or Storm Kelpies, were said to haunt the waters between the Isle of Lewis and the mainland, creating storms and challenging captains with poetic riddles, which, if went unanswered, would lead to shipwrecks. There is also the legend of the Coo Sith, a spectral hound that inhabited the highlands, but was also known to leave large footprints on the shore. On a more practical level, there were greater dangers to be found on the shore than mythical dogs and fairy folk, because if people were making a living by journeying to sea and back, there were certainly those who were ready to take that living from them. Across the world, shipwreckers would deliberately draw ships onto rocks and sandbanks by hanging lanterns to mimic lighthouses, killing the survivors and plundering the dead. No surprise then that historical fact would often find its way into local legend and superstition as time went by, with ghost stories telling of spirits walking the beaches or cliffs, persecuting the wreckers, or luring them to their own death by using phantom bells and ghost lights. In fact, our second film this week, The Fog, is, according to director John Carpenter, based on a true incident where a ship was deliberately wrecked off the coast of California to obtain the gold that formed part of the cargo. Smugglers too would become the basis of many a ghost story, often because they met untimely ends at the hands of law enforcement or due to their own acts of violence, which were, by all accounts, quite considerable. Again, these stories appear worldwide, and more often than not are created as a deterrent to keep people away from dangerous locations, or, in more than a hint of Scooby-Doo, set up to stop people snooping where they weren't wanted. In literature, writers have been inspired by both myth and history to use the coast as settings for supernatural and disturbing narratives. In 1793, the English poet and writer Mary Robinson published The Haunted Beach, a Gothic poem about a fisherman who witnesses a band of spectres gliding along the beach. These are the ghosts of drowned sailors, and it is initially suggested that the beach is haunted by the memories of those who have lost their lives at sea. However, the final verse of the poem reveals that the fisherman is himself a murderer, having killed one of the surviving sailors from a shipwreck in order to obtain his gold. As a punishment, he is doomed to spend the rest of his life living in his fisherman's hut, haunted by these spectres on the beach. Staying in England, the so-called father of the modern ghost story, M.R. James, often sets stories on the east coast of the country, most notably his ghostly tales, O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, and A Warning to the Curious. O Whistle tells the story of a college professor who finds an old whistle buried in the remains of a monastery near the shore on the Suffolk coast, and then finds himself being followed along the deserted shore by a, quote, shape of a rather indistinct personage, end quote. The story has been filmed at least 3 times, the most famous of which was directed by Jonathan Miller in 1968, and which certainly makes the most of the atmospheric windswept shoreline and deserted beaches. A similar fate awaits the hero of the story A Warning to the Curious, in which an archaeologist goes treasure hunting along the English coast in search of a lost crown that is said to protect Great Britain against invasion. Rather foolishly, on discovering it, he digs it up to take it away, and again is pursued by something malevolent that leaves footprints showing more bones than flesh in the sand. This again was filmed, this time for the annual BBC A Ghost Story for Christmas strand, and both it and O Whistle are available for rental on Amazon, and also, if you're in the US, they're available for streaming on Shudder. The English novelist Daphne du Maurier most famously wrote about smugglers in her novel Jamaica Inn, but perhaps more famously for fans of the horror movie, she also wrote the short story The Birds, which was later adapted into the 1963 Hitchcock movie. Whilst Hitchcock's film is, of course, a masterpiece, Du Maurier's story is far darker and a much more grounded affair, set amidst an isolated farming community in Cornwall, who notice that the bird attacks coincide with the rising and the ebbing of the tides. Whilst the Hitchcock movie ends on an ambiguous note, but suggests there may be a light at the end of the highway, the original story is far bleaker. At one point near the climax, the protagonist, a farmer called Nat, is barricading his house when he thinks that he sees the Navy out at sea, coming to provide help. Quote, "He paused, his work on the bedroom chimney finished, and looked out to sea. Something was moving out there, something grey and white amongst the breakers. Good old Navy, he said, they never let us down. They're coming down the channel, they're turning in the bay." He waited, straining his eyes, watering in the wind toward the sea. He was wrong, though. It was not ships. The Navy was not there. The gulls were rising from the sea. The massed flocks in the fields, with ruffled feathers, rose in formation from the ground and, wing to wing, soared upward to the sky. The tide had turned again. End quote. The story ends not with rescue or escape, but with the likelihood that Nat and his young family are all doomed to perish, though this is not explicitly stated. More surreal is the work of H.P. Lovecraft, who often sets his stories among the coastal communities of New England, particularly in his fictional towns of Arkham and, most relevant here, Innsmouth. In his story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, a student travels to a deserted fishing town, the Innsmouth of the title, and finds it to be mostly dilapidated and full of people who walk with a distinctive shambling gait and who have an incredibly strange complexion. As the story progresses, he realises that the town is cursed, and that most of the townsfolk are doomed to become amphibious monstrosities as they age. This story has been combined with other work from Lovecraft and adapted for the screen in the movies Dagon, directed by Stuart Gordon in 2001, and Cthulhu in 2007. Though personally, I would say that our first movie this week, Messiah of Evil, is probably closer in spirit, if not in storyline. Meanwhile, in 1981, Michael McDowell, the writer of Beetlejuice and the co-writer of The Nightmare Before Christmas, released his novel The Elementals, about a rich southern family vacationing in their summer holiday home that is slowly being overrun by sand and the supernatural. Some of the racial politics in the book are, admittedly, a little dated, to put it mildly, but it is an arresting piece of Southern Gothic, with some very disquieting moments. In cinema, aside from the obvious horrors of Jaws and any number of shark and octopus movies, we have also seen more subtle and haunting entries in the coastal horror subgenre. In 1961, director Curtis Harrington gave us his film Night Tide, in which a very young Dennis Hopper plays a sailor on shore leave, who falls for a woman who may or may not be a mermaid, and who may or may not be murdering her lovers. Set in an off-season Venice Beach, California, this has more in common with the works of Val Lewton than it does Steven Spielberg, and is a subtle, shadowy, and ultimately incredibly melancholy affair. A year later, in 1962, director Herc Harvey released his movie Carnival of Souls, which, strictly speaking, is set by a lagoon as opposed to the ocean. That being said, with its broken-down pavilion that calls out to its haunted and doomed heroine, and ghostly figures rising from the water to chase her across the sand, it certainly belongs here far more than it does anywhere else. Both of these movies act as direct predecessors to our first film, and are available to watch on YouTube, though, as always, I suggest you avoid watching the colorized versions. All of which brings us to the first of this week's movies. Messiah of Evil was written by Willard Huck and Gloria Katz, who also took on the respective roles of director and producer. It stars Marianna Hill, Michael Greer, Anitra Ford, Joy Bang, and Elisha Cook Jr., and was released in 1973. Hollywood in the 1960s and early 1970s was an industry in a state of crisis. This was the culmination of a period where the major studios came close to the brink of bankruptcy, and the classic studio system started to collapse, mainly due to a shifting audience demographic, the rise of television, and dramatically changing tastes in cinema. Following World War II, more and more Americans were buying new homes in the suburbs, starting families, and orientating their lives towards more home-based activities, including television. By 1955, weekly cinema attendance had pretty much halved compared to what it had been in 1946, and this financial loss only compounded the impact of a significant legal proceeding that had taken place just a few years earlier. In 1948, the Supreme Court issued what has become known as the Paramount Decree, which forced studios to end their monopoly on theatre chain ownership and gave theatre owners the right to set their own ticket prices. This meant that the major studios could no longer guarantee screens for their own films, which killed the business model that had held a monopoly on the market up until this point, and meant that every film release now had to compete in the open market. This gave rise to the birth of independent cinema and the art house circuit, and smaller studios and independent producers were able to gain more access to cinemas than had ever been possible. Audience tastes and demographics were also changing significantly. Between 1946 and 1964, around 76 million Americans were born, and so by the mid-1960s, this massive cohort was starting to enter adolescence, creating an unprecedented youth audience of a size that really hadn't ever been seen before. And while studios in the 1940s had aimed their products at a very middle-class and family-orientated audience, there was now a new generation with very different tastes and very different attitudes towards sex, violence, and authority. The art house circuit, now growing after the freedoms granted by the Paramount Decree, brought a new world of cinema to American audiences, all films which inspired a young generation of new filmmakers. Independent cinema, and importantly for us, independent horror, was also on the rise, both through art house and, admittedly, at the other end of the scale, the drive-in movie circuit. But what really broke the camel's back was an incredible miscalculation by the major studios, who, in a rather desperate attempt to compete with TV, decided to put their money into large-scale spectacle movies with budgets and visuals that TV couldn't match. The logic was to make fewer but much bigger films. But with this strategy, there was a rather significant problem. These movies were incredibly expensive to produce, and if audiences stayed at home, the financial repercussions were devastating. In the 1960s, there were a number of flops that really rocked the Hollywood boat, and brought several of the major studios to their knees. These included Cleopatra in 1963, which nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox, and the rather ironically titled The Fall of the Roman Empire, which nearly did the same to Paramount Studios in the same year. In addition, a string of old-fashioned musicals, including Dr. Dolittle in 1967 and Paint Your Wagon in 1968, dramatically misjudged audience appeal and were very out of step with the cultural mood. It is, of course, very hard to imagine these days that a big production studio would be out of step with the cultural zeitgeist, but I guess times change. Or then again, as research in this series is increasingly teaching me, maybe they don't really change at all. And so, by 1967, the stage was set for the birth of a new style of cinema, and this was a period that is now known as either quote-unquote New Hollywood or the Hollywood Renaissance. The unexpected success of much lower budget films like Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Rosemary's Baby in 1968, and Easy Rider in 1969 showed that there was a possibility of huge financial returns at minimal risk, and opened the doors to a new generation of young and often film school educated directors who had grown up and honed their tastes on European art house cinema, and who could also speak to the counterculture and the growing youth market. As we discussed a few weeks ago, these filmmakers often first cut their teeth working for exploitation master Roger Corman, including Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, Joe Dante, Jonathan Demme, and Francis Ford Coppola. In 1969, Coppola would co-found the studio American Zoetrope with his friend George Lucas, a company that would produce Lucas's first two movies, THX 1138 and American Graffiti. While the first was praised by the critics, it wasn't a big hit. But all of that would change with American Graffiti, a coming-of-age comedy drama that would go on to become one of the most profitable films of all time, earning $200 million in box office and home video revenue off a budget of just under $800,000. The writers on this movie were George Lucas himself and friends from the USC Film School, Willard Huck and Gloria Katz, the creators of Messiah of Evil. And here we are getting heavily into spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, it's time to hit pause and track it down. Now, fortunately, there are many versions of this film freely available on YouTube, so if you don't have the money for rental, then you can certainly watch it free of charge. What I would say, though, is, if at all possible, do try to track down the restored version if you can. For many years I watched the rather degraded versions on streaming platforms, and I have to say that watching the restoration was like watching an entirely different movie. And as this film is really all about the visuals, it really is money well spent. Willard Huck and Gloria Katz, who were a married couple and who had met through a mutual love of Roger Corman movies, had just finished working on the treatment for American Graffiti when they got a call from their former agent, who had moved out of agent work and into movie production. He told them that he could raise $100,000 for them to make their first movie, as he had secured financing from a group of private investors in Texas. The only stipulation was that it had to be a horror film, which was seen as a highly profitable genre at the time. So they stepped away from working on American Graffiti and started working on a screenplay, which took approximately 3 weeks to write. Messiah of Evil tells the story of a young woman called Arletty, who travels to the town of Point June in California to find her artist father, with whom she has lost contact and believes to be missing. On arriving at his home, which is decorated by haunting murals on nearly every wall, she finds his diary, but his rather rambling entries are incoherent and provide very few clues as to his whereabouts. Driving into town, she meets up with a playboy adventurer called Tom and his two female companions, Laura and Tony. Gradually, the town's secrets start to unravel, which include a strange sickness, possession, zombification, religious cults, and a centuries-old preacher who may or may not be returning from the sea to reclaim the world. As you might be able to tell from this very potted summary, the film draws heavily from both Night of the Living Dead and the works of H.P. Lovecraft, and many people have called it one of the most Lovecraftian films ever made, in tone and atmosphere, if not exactly in content. There are, after all, no many tentacled monsters here, but there is certainly a similarity with his works like The Shadow over Innsmouth that we discussed earlier in the episode. Both Huck and Katz were fans of the writer, particularly the sense of doom and perversity that pervades much of his work. But if the two took inspiration from Lovecraft and Romero, and there is no doubt that Night of the Living Dead is a big influence here, they took very little from other horror writers of the period, with Huck stating that he preferred the classic horrors of the 30s and 40s above those of his filmmaking contemporaries. But what they were also influenced by was the art house European movies of filmmakers such as Antonioni and Fellini. In fact, Gloria Katz has said that Messiah of Evil is really an attempt to make a horror movie in the style of Antonioni. And this idea, the directors of a low-budget horror movie trying to ape one of the masters of Italian cinema may seem a little bit pretentious, but, as I mentioned earlier, many of the new wave of American filmmakers, all of whom greatly admired European art house, had cut their teeth working on low-budget exploitation movies. The journey from film school to artistic and creative credibility via the horror genre was certainly not an unusual one, so it probably made perfect sense to make Messiah of Evil a calling card to the film industry. Michelangelo Antonioni has been called a chronicler of bourgeois ennui, something that we see here in the characters of Tom and Laura, and he's also particularly well known for his visual style. This style has been described by the British Film Institute as extremely long takes, striking modern architecture, painterly use of colour, and tiny human figures adrift in an empty landscape. And we can certainly see echoes of that approach in the modern landscapes that the characters in Messiah of Evil occupy. These include illuminated gas stations that seem adrift in a sea of blackness, empty supermarket parking lots, the deserted streets of Point June, and the at first seemingly deserted supermarket and cinema where Laura and Tony meet their respective dooms. This is not just a nod to the Italian master, but also seems to be a commentary on Americana, with the supposedly idyllic town of Point June slowly rotting beneath the surface. This is a theme or mood that we see in many films of the period, but to be honest, it's impossible to state for certain that Messiah of Evil is intentionally about anything. By the director's own admission, it's such an odd film that it really is open to viewer interpretation, though Gloria Katz also said that the spirit of the ongoing Vietnam War was clearly heavy on everyone's minds at the time, and that she felt it most likely seeped into the narrative and feel of the film. There is a quite brilliant line given by Arletty's father in one of his diary voiceovers, saying, quote, "If the cities of the world were destroyed tomorrow, they would all be rebuilt to look like Point June, entirely normal, quiet, silent. Though the shared horror, I know, is hiding beneath its stuccoed skin." End quote. And this sentiment is quite brilliantly underlined by the cinema marquee, displaying the legend "Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye." The use of colour is also incredibly striking. Filmed in widescreen and Techniscope, which was essentially a more budget-friendly version of Technicolor, the lighting and cinematography is nothing short of stunning, and certainly foreshadows the work of directors like Dario Argento and his movies Suspiria and Inferno. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the interiors of the artist's studio, decorated with huge murals that stare out of the walls and seem to become additional characters in and of themselves. These were painted directly onto the walls of the shooting location by an artist called Joan Mossine, with the brief that the murals should reflect Arletty's father morphing into one of the undead, and also to project an empty feeling, one of slight dread without any real violence. They are incredibly disorientating, not least the one of a couple staring through a window, or the man in a suit, which has a real taxidermy dog sitting at his feet. Cinematographer Stephen Katz, who, as the name suggests, was Gloria's brother, tried to frame the real-life characters against the people in the paintings. But it is not just the interiors of the studio that are beautiful to look at. Even the opening sequence where an unnamed minor character meets a very violent end at the hands of a little girl is really quite sumptuous in its use of colour and lighting. This character, by the way, is played by the director Walter Hill, who went on to direct The Warriors, Streets of Fire, 48 Hours and Southern Comfort. The lead role of Arletty is played by Mariana Hill, who presents as a dreamlike figure, almost existing in a trance, not unlike the character played by Candace Hillgloss in Carnival of Souls that we mentioned just a few moments ago. She was mainly known for TV work, including roles on TV shows like The Tall Man, Gunsmoke and Bonanza, and also had appeared in an episode of Star Trek, but she was relatively unknown as a cinema actress. Huck described working with her as a fun experience, punctuated by many dirty jokes off camera, and that she brought a dreamy Alice in Wonderland take to her character. She is joined by Michael Greer, who plays the lead male role of Tom, a bored and presumably wealthy drifter who collects stories for his amusement and seems to be in a throuple with the equally bored Laura, played by Anitra Ford, and Tony, played by Joy Bang. Greer was born James Robert Malley and was an American actor, comedian and cabaret performer. He was also one of the first openly gay actors to appear in major Hollywood films, and was perhaps best known as a female impersonator. In fact, his impersonation of Betty Davis was so perfect that he was actually asked to dub in some of her lines for the TV miniseries The Dark Secret of Harvest Home in 1978, and again in the movie Wicked Stepmother in 1989. He is, it must be said, not the first choice one would have made for a lead role in a horror movie, but his casting fits the ambience of the film incredibly well, and again fits into the idea of the ennui of the bourgeoisie that we see in many an Antonioni movie. We first meet him in a motel room where he is recording an interview with local homeless man Charlie, who is played by Elisha Cook Jr. And Elisha Cook Jr. was an American character actor who is probably best known for his work in film noir, most notably in the 1941 version of The Maltese Falcon and also in The Big Sleep and The Killing. But horror fans will probably know him best for his role in the movie The House on Haunted Hill in 1959, and also in Rosemary's Baby in 1968. According to Huck, he found looking directly into the camera for his monologue incredibly uncomfortable, saying that this was the first time in his career he'd ever had to look directly into a camera, and had in fact spent his whole life learning and being told to not do so. So perhaps, understandably, he found this rather hard to do. It's through the character of Charlie that we learn some of the legend of the movie, most notably that of the blood moon, and that the bodies of the dead must be burned, or they will come back. This, of course, leads to the assumption that the locals who prowl the town and kill Laura in the supermarket and Tony in the cinema are some kind of zombie, and this is a debate that has gone back and forth since the film's release. In fact, the film was released at one point under the title The Return of the Living Dead, until George Romero's lawyers stepped in, but more on that a bit later on. From my perspective, these are, of course, not your typical zombies that we would see either in the films of the 1940s or indeed the films following Night of the Living Dead. They seem instead to be people possessed, either spiritually or through some form of virus, and are certainly more animated than George A. Romero's walking corpses. In fact, they probably have more in common with The Infected from 28 Days Later and its sequels than they do with the films that preceded Messiah of Evil. The actual reason for their being goes unexplained, but we certainly do know from the scene in which a cop turns and starts to devour his fallen colleague that it is more likely to be some form of infection or mass hysteria than it is anything else. The blood dripping from the eyes is also something we would see much later in John Carpenter's brilliant Lovecraftian movie In the Mouth of Madness, and I wonder whether he took more than a little inspiration from this movie when he was designing that effect. There are, of course, two pivotal scenes in the movie that are the most talked about, and these are the supermarket sequence in which Laura meets a particularly nasty comeuppance, and the cinema sequence in which Tony is slowly surrounded by the zombified locals. The first moment has been mentioned by horror fans as foreshadowing the consumerism of Dawn of the Dead, while the second is a much more direct homage to Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, with the dead slowly surrounding Tony, mimicking the scene in which Tippi Hedren smokes a cigarette outside the local school, not realising that the birds are slowly gathering on the climbing frame behind her. Filming of the movie took place in the summer of 1971, mostly in Echo Park and other areas of Los Angeles, but also on the beaches in and around Malibu. And while the creators said that overall it was a fun experience, filming was far from being an easy process. Although they had been promised a budget of $100,000, they were actually only given $85,000, as one of the middlemen between the production and the investors skimmed $15,000 off the money to re-roof their house. This led to some rather uncomfortable situations where people didn't get paid, or at the very least, didn't get paid on time. At one point, Michael Greer was pulled over by local policemen who had acted as security officers on the production and had also played roles as extras. They were perhaps not surprisingly incredibly annoyed that they hadn't been paid for their time and efforts, and they threatened to hold on to him in jail until the director coughed up the money that was owed to them. Needless to say, the money was very quickly handed over. In fact, according to Willard Huck, the two cops were the only people who ever ended up getting properly paid. The lack of money also meant that key sequences were never shot, and a proper ending was never filmed after the production ran out of cash. The last sequence of the movie, on the beach, was supposed to be much more spectacular, at least according to the director, and they also never really shot the movie theatre sequence in the way that they intended to. So, while the film was always intended to be dreamlike and fragmented, it also lacks the explanation that the filmmakers perhaps intended, although, to be honest, they've never really specified exactly what that was. Once they had their initial work print, the production team tried to sell it, but they were incredibly unsuccessful and were eventually told by their new agents to stop trying because it was ruining their careers. Eventually, a group of the original investors sued the executive producers, and the team actually ended up losing the movie altogether, with their work prints and all of the outtakes literally loaded up onto a truck and driven off in front of them. Anitra Ford, who played Laura, said in an interview that the footage was then sold to a French producer who re-edited some parts and added in others. For example, in the movie theatre sequence, the clips that are being shown are from an unreleased western called Gone with the West, and these were inserted simply because the new production company owned the rights to that footage. While these post-production challenges left the narrative rather opaque, later critics have argued that the disjointed structure contributes to the film's surreal and dreamlike atmosphere. Huck himself has described the film as an odd piece of work whose ambiguity invites the audience's imagination, which is an unintended outcome of an incredibly troubled editing process. Much of the narration was added after the fact to try to give some cohesion to the dreamlike structure, but in fact it only adds new layers to the mystery. The structure has ended up being that of stories told within stories, first the narration of Arletty in the asylum, and then within that narration the narrative of her father as he is reading from his journals. This feels very much like a Russian doll, or the disorientating effect of paintings within paintings within paintings. But none of this, of course, was at all the filmmaker's original intention. According to Huck, people that they never met did some recutting and rescoring, and finally released the movie several times under different titles. This, at one point, led to his father, who was also called Willard Huck, being served a court summons stating that he was being sued by George Romero for title infringement when it was released by somebody as Return of the Living Dead. Huck himself doesn't know who came up with the title Messiah of Evil, but he agrees that it is certainly catchy, and much better than their original working title for the movie, which was Blood Virgin. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a film with this title was rather difficult to cast, as they couldn't get actors to audition, so before filming the title was changed to The Second Coming, although, according to Huck, actors still wouldn't audition, because then they thought they were going to be making a porn movie. Despite this incredibly troubled post-production and drastic re-editing process, the film has gone on to become a cult classic, sitting side by side with other dreamlike narratives of the 1970s, such as Let's Scare Jessica to Death and Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural. It has been called by many the perfect evocation of a dream or a nightmare, and is surprisingly perhaps all the more effective for the fact that it doesn't really explain anything and has an incredibly elliptical narrative. In 2018, IndieWire ranked it at number 95 on its list of the 150 greatest horror movies of all time, and the British Film Institute have referred to it as a rare work of cinematic genius, which, given its tortured post-production and editing process, is a testament to the gods of serendipity, if nothing else. As you can tell from this review, I like the film very much, particularly its visual style and its very strange narrative. And for me, it's a film that is for and about the end of the world. And given where society is at the moment, it really couldn't be more appropriate. All of which brings us to our second film this week, which also had an interesting post-production and editing process. And this is John Carpenter's The Fog from 1980. This was written by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, and stars Adrienne Barbeau, Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Janet Leigh, and Hal Holbrook. And we're going to get into spoilers relatively early with this one, so if you haven't seen it yet, you know what to do. John Carpenter was born in 1948 in Carthage, New York, and when he was 5, his family moved to Kentucky, where his father taught music at Western Kentucky University. He was fascinated by music and films from a very early age, and began making short films with an 8mm camera before he was in high school. On graduating from high school, he enrolled at the University of Kentucky as an English major, but then transferred to the University of Southern California for their cinematic arts course. It was here, after seeing George Lucas's debut, THX 1138, that he started work on what would become his first feature movie, Dark Star, which he co-wrote with Dan O'Bannon, who would go on to direct Return of the Living Dead in 1985. On its release in 1974, Dark Star didn't exactly set the world alight, and generated what Carpenter called his first bad review from Variety magazine. He fared little better with his next film, Assault on Precinct 13, which was released in 1976, and which was influenced by the films of Howard Hawks, a director that Carpenter had admired since watching his films as a child. According to an interview that he gave the New Yorker in 1980, quote, "The major studios weren't interested in it. It was a strange movie, and they didn't know how to sell it. It was the second time that I had a film make no money. I tried not to get too upset or take it personally, but no one wanted me as a director. A year later, I was in the commissary at Warner Brothers, where I had just finished directing my first TV movie, when a stranger came up and told me that the film was breaking attendance records in England. The news and reviews filtered back, and there began to be interest in me as a director, but it all came so long after I'd made the picture, I'd gotten used to the idea that the film was going to fail." End quote. Carpenter has said that he considers Assault on Precinct 13 to have been his first real film, because it was a movie that he filmed on a schedule, and it also marked the first time that he would work with Deborah Hill, who at this time was a script supervisor, and who would go on to collaborate with him on many of his best-known movies. In 1978, he wrote and directed a made-for-TV movie, which was originally called High Rise, but underwent a title change to become Someone's Watching Me. This featured model-turned-actress Lauren Hutton as a TV director who, after moving into a new apartment block, finds that first she is being watched, and then ultimately terrorized by a stalker. This film also featured the actress Adrienne Barbeau, with whom Carpenter would begin a relationship and who he would go on to marry. However, it was of course with Halloween, that was also released in 1978, that Carpenter really made his name as a director. This was originally a very low-budget idea suggested by the producer Erwin Yablans, and was originally called The Babysitter Murders, but Carpenter took the basic idea and developed the story. Strangely enough, at the time, Halloween night had never been the theme of a movie. This film was written by Carpenter and Deborah Hill, and the music was of course famously also scored by Carpenter himself, who said that the score was influenced by Dario Argento's Suspiria and William Friedkin's The Exorcist. This low-budget movie was originally made for $300,000, but it grossed more than $65 million, making it one of the most successful independent movies of all time. Carpenter has gone on to say, however, that Halloween did not have an immediate impact on its initial release, and it was really word of mouth over the subsequent months that turned it into the success that it became. In the December of that year, he was offered a 2-picture deal with the production company Avco Embassy, and says that he wrote the screenplay for The Fog in January 1979. By the time he had completed it, Halloween had become not just a success, but a phenomenon. But, of course, with any success comes an inevitable pressure to follow it with something equally successful, and, as Halloween was a horror movie, there was also a pressure to follow it with something that was equally as frightening. But Carpenter didn't want to make another straightforward slasher. He instead was more interested in giving a modern spin on an old-fashioned ghost story. Stylistically, he wanted to do something much more closer to the work of Val Lewton, saying in an interview that he wanted to do a movie that was similar to Isle of the Dead, which we covered a few weeks ago, and something that was based more on shadows and suggestion. Now, this may come as a surprise to those of you who have seen the movie, with its worm-faced ghosts and glowing red eyes, but as we'll discover, this was not the original intention behind the film at all. The idea for the movie had originated when he and Deborah Hill were travelling in England and visited Stonehenge, seeing it surrounded by fog. Carpenter turned to Hill and asked her, "What if there's something inside that fog? Wouldn't it be scary?" But this idea did not just spring out of nowhere. As a child, he had seen and enjoyed the British science fiction movie The Trollenberg Terror, which is also known as The Crawling Eye. In this movie, alien monstrosities invade a mountain resort in Switzerland by hiding in a bank of clouds and fog. And although Carpenter's film doesn't have giant crawling eyes, there are certainly parallels between the two movies if you watch them side by side. This would not be the only 1950s British science fiction movie that would inspire The Fog. Carpenter has gone on record to say that the scene in the movie where Jamie Lee Curtis and Tom Atkins are stuck in a van trying to back away from the fog is directly ripped off from the British science fiction movie X the Unknown. There are also echoes of Howard Hawks' movie The Thing from Another World at the climax of the movie, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. Carpenter has said that the plot of the film was also inspired by a real-life historical event which occurred just off the coast of California, in which a ship carrying gold bullion was deliberately wrecked by those on the shore, using the concept of misleading lights, something that we spoke about at the beginning of the episode. The basic story is that the town of Antonio Bay is celebrating its 100th anniversary, but it is not, as the celebrants would like to believe, built on the nobility of its ancestors. It is instead built on the back of theft and cold-blooded murder. Many years before, a group of lepers, led by an incredibly wealthy man called Blake, had aimed to set up a colony near the small town, and had instead been lured to their death so the town could steal their gold. Now, 100 years later, Blake and his crew are back and seeking revenge. The movie sets out its stall very early and opens with a line from Edgar Allan Poe, which was included in post-production at the prompting of producer and co-writer Deborah Hill. Poe, of course, is the poster boy for American Gothic, and so it's hardly surprising that we cut directly from this quote to John Houseman telling ghost stories to a group of small children as they sit around a fire. His character, Mr. Macon, is named after the Welsh writer Arthur Macon, who is perhaps best known for his fantasy, horror and weird fiction. These references to two classic writers in the opening moments is a world away from Michael Myers and Haddonfield, though, to be fair, we don't learn Mr. Macon's name until at least 20 minutes later into the film. Nevertheless, this slow-paced and atmospheric beginning, with its melodic and mournful piano score, certainly sets the film apart from the tone of Halloween, and the slice and dice activities of the preteen Michael Myers that opened the original movie. Suffice it to say that following the juggernaut of Halloween with a more subtle and old-fashioned ghost story inspired by the works of Val Lewton was a pretty big gamble, and one that did not necessarily pay off once the initial filming was completed. Carpenter originally wanted a movie where the fog was a malevolent character and a force of evil in and of itself, but that wasn't necessarily going to fly with modern audiences, and this certainly became evident in the film's initial test screenings. Test audiences, and Carpenter himself, were unimpressed by people who just seemed to disappear into the fog. At the same time, David Cronenberg had just released his movie Scanners, and this had pushed horror into a different and much more explicit direction. It became evident to Carpenter that extensive reshoots and re-editing were required in order for the film to be anything close to being successful. I've made a decision in this episode to not point out the many scenes that were added in post-production as a result of this process, as I think that might ruin the movie for some people. But I think it's enough to say that the movie we now see before us was not the one that was originally on the page, or indeed, the one that was originally first filmed. Once the script was completed and the movie greenlit, the most important thing was finding the locations, particularly the lighthouse from which DJ Stevie Wayne would warn the rest of the town of the encroaching dangers of the fog. This was found in the town of Point Reyes in California, and other locations were then found around it, mainly in the town of Inverness, which is, ironically enough, according to Deborah Hill, one of the foggiest places in America, second only to Nantucket. The beach where young Andy finds the haunted piece of driftwood is Drake's Beach, which is an hour's drive down the road from Bodega Bay, where Alfred Hitchcock filmed The Birds. And that's a story which seems to be very much a thread in this week's episode. And while the locations of the fog and Messiah of Evil are certainly not the same, there is a synergy between the two, most notably in the eerie opening sequences of poltergeist activity that beset Antonio Bay, with its empty streets and empty market echoing the deserted town of Point June. But Antonio Bay is of course not really deserted. It is inhabited by a large population, many of whom will be familiar to anyone who has watched other John Carpenter movies. First up is Adrienne Barbeau, who Carpenter had met on Someone Is Watching Me, and who by this time was his wife. She plays the radio DJ Stevie Wayne, and Carpenter has come under some criticism from the radio community for the lack of accuracy in the KAB radio station setup. I myself remember a Radio 1 DJ being particularly critical the morning after the movie was shown on TV, complaining that Stevie Wayne didn't even have a pair of headphones, which just goes to show how far broadcasting has come since the 1980s. And although it's hard to pick out a leading role in what is essentially an ensemble piece, I guess that Stevie is our central character. She certainly has some of the best moments in the film, which is quite hard to accomplish, given that she is pretty much flying solo, delivering most of her dialogue down the telephone or microphone, and with no one to really bounce off. She also has what were originally meant to be the closing lines of the film, warning the viewer to keep looking out for the fog. This is an homage to the Howard Hawks movie, The Thing from Another World, which Carpenter had long been a fan of, and of course would go on to remake just a few years later. My favourite moment, though, comes earlier in the film, where the malignant ghost Blake manifests itself first through a piece of driftwood, and then through the recording of the radio station promos that she has left playing on the counter. As water seeps into the tape player, we hear the voice of Blake, provided by actor Charles Nicklin, distortedly reference the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner as he curses the town of Antonio Bay, saying, "Something that one lives with like an albatross around the neck. No, more like a millstone. A plumbing stone, by God. Damn them all." As Stevie turns, the driftwood displays the legend that 6 must die, before bursting into flames in a basic but highly effective piece of pyrotechnics, courtesy of A&A Special Effects, who had also worked on Assault on Precinct 13. And, as a quick aside, whilst Charles Nicklin provided the voice of Blake, The body of Blake was that of Rob Bottin, who handled the various special makeup effects on the movie. Blake's glowing red eyes that we see in the climax were made using a rubber mask and Scotchlight, a reflective material that is used on stop signs, and it was when Bottin was modelling the creation for Carpenter that it was decided that he should play the role of Blake himself, as he also had the right build for the character. And it was on the strength of the makeup work that he did on The Fog that Bottin was hired to do the effects work on Carpenter's The Thing in 1982, a milestone in practical effects makeup that still has the power to drop jaws even today. Joining Barbeau is Jamie Lee Curtis, who had struggled to find work coming off Halloween, apart from guest spots on TV shows like Charlie's Angels. Carpenter and Hill wrote the role in the movie for her as a result, something for which Curtis remains grateful, although she has also, retrospectively, expressed surprise that the film has gone on to achieve such a cult status, as she didn't consider it to be a particularly good movie. It's a very different role to the innocent Laurie Strode of Halloween. Here she plays Elizabeth, a quintessential poor little rich girl who is hitchhiking her way along the California coast, and who catches a ride with Nick Castle, played by Tom Atkins. Atkins, as many listeners will know, became something of an iconic figure in 1980s horror, appearing in this, Halloween 3, Night of the Creeps, and Maniac Cop, to name just a few. His character is named after Nick Castle, who had played the Shape in Halloween, and he is not the only character named after real people. Tommy Wallace, who comes to a rather nasty end on the seagrass, is in real life a director, editor and sound designer, who also appears as a ghost in the movie. Dan the Weatherman, who comes to a rather nasty end at the weather station, was named after Dan O'Bannon, the creator of Darkstar, and Mrs. Cobritz, who comes to a rather nasty end babysitting Andy, is named after the producer of Carpenter's 1978 TV movie, Someone's Watching Me. Carpenter has said that this approach to naming characters and locations after real people and real streets has made the naming conventions in his movies an easier process, though, to be honest, if I were Wallace, O'Bannon and Cobritz, I may have some concerns about Carpenter's unconscious fantasies. As well as these characters, the town coroner is named after the Vincent Price character Dr. Phibes, and there's also reference to Arkham Reef, which is a direct reference to the fictional New England town of Arkham, created by H.P. Lovecraft and subsequently referenced in any number of weird fiction movies, as well as, of course, Batman. In a testament to the nature of the increased budget for this movie, Carpenter was also able to cast real Hollywood royalty in the form of Janet Leigh, Hal Holbrook, and John Houseman. Though, as the budget was still not that great, Houseman and Holbrook's scenes had to be filmed in an incredibly condensed time frame. Janet Leigh is probably most famous for her role in Psycho, and was of course Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. This movie, along with Halloween H2O, would be the only times that mother and daughter would work on the same film, and by all accounts, it was a very enjoyable experience on set. She plays the town councilwoman Kathy Williams, who, in her brisk efficiency and desire to cover up the crimes of the past, has more than a little in common with the mayor in the Jaws movies. And the fact that she survives the night when she seems to be the most natural stand-in for the conspirators of the past seems a bit of a wasted opportunity. She certainly deserves it far more than poor Mrs. Cobritz does. Nevertheless, it's an incredibly good performance, particularly the interplay with her secretary Sandy, played by Nancy Loomis. Loomis, of course, had played the ill-fated Annie in Halloween, but she had also appeared in Assault on Precinct 13 a few years earlier, and her world-weary sarcasm brings a touch of humour to the proceedings, while still showing off humanity when Kathy Williams is notified of her husband's passing. Hal Holbrook, who is perhaps not as well known as he should be these days, was a multi-award-winning actor, winning 5 Primetime Emmy Awards for his work on television, and he would also go on to be Oscar-nominated for the movie Into the Wild in 2007. Prior to The Fog, he had gained international fame for his performance in the 1976 movie All the President's Men, as well as in the multi-Oscar-nominated film Julia, in which he co-starred opposite Meryl Streep in her first leading role. His performance as the alcoholic Father Malone, who sinks further and further into the bottle and into guilt as the crimes of his ancestor are revealed, is very well played. Most notably, the scene where he is reading from his grandfather's diary to a rather unimpressed Kathy Williams, who would much rather that the whole thing just went away. Again, I can't understand why Blake didn't take her out. Perhaps the most legendary of all three, though, was John Houseman, who was a producer, actor, director, and teacher, and he was also the founding director of the Juilliard School of Acting. In cinematic terms, he is probably best known for his work with Orson Welles, as well as for winning an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in 1973 for the movie The Paper Chase. He was also nominated for a Production Academy Award for Julius Caesar in 1953, and was also nominated for 4 Golden Globe Awards. Both Carpenter and Deborah Hill have said that his presence alone made him an incredibly intimidating figure to have on set. However, the tension was very quickly relieved when he fluffed his lines, swore profusely, and showed a humanity behind the legend that managed to calm everyone's nerves. Joining the cast are other actors who had either already worked with Carpenter or who would go on to do so. Charles Cyphers, who plays the ill-fated Dan the Weatherman, had worked on Assault on Precinct 13 and had also played the sheriff in Halloween. He would also go on to appear in Escape from New York. And Buck Flowers would appear in Escape from New York, Starman, They Live, and Carpenter's remake of Village of the Damned. We should also probably mention Carpenter himself, who makes an uncredited Hitchcockian cameo as the disgruntled church assistant Bennett, and who recalled of the experience that he was so nervous working opposite Hal Holbrook and thought he did such a bad job that he resolved to never act again. And this is something that he held up until he played a crypt keeper-like mortuary attendant in the movie Body Bags in 1993. As with the vast majority of his movies, Carpenter also wrote the score for The Fog. In fact, he actually wrote 2, as this was another thing that changed after the initial test screening. Naturally, I can't speak to the original concept, but personally, I feel the final score for the movie is among some of Carpenter's best work, with its simple but melancholy piano refrain capturing the atmosphere perfectly. Carpenter says that his composition process is inspired by Bernard Herrmann, but is also cheap, fast, and riff-driven, which is probably a good thing, given that he had to rescore the movie twice. There is also a real sadness to the score, which underlines the ultimate tragedy of the backstory, where innocent and diseased people, the essence of the outsider, were cold-bloodedly murdered for the sake of capitalism. In addition to the score, the sound design is also incredibly well done. And in fact, this is a movie where you hear far more than you see. Apart from a sword through the chest and a blink and you miss it throat-slashing sequence, the rest of the violence is created through cutaways and Foley work, the puncturing of eyeballs, the stabbing of Mrs. Cobritz, who, once again, really didn't deserve it, and even the ultimate decapitation of Father Malone at the end of the movie, are all suggested through sharp editing and sound effects as opposed to visuals. Visually, though, the film is striking, though not in the same way as Messiah of Evil. As with Halloween, Carpenter and cinematographer Dean Cundy opted to use widescreen, and Carpenter has said that his visual composition is inspired very much by Howard Hawks from the 1950s, in that it is all about the placement of the camera. This is particularly evident in the scene where Jamie Lee Curtis is waiting in the coroner's office, and the camera is placed underneath a gurney to see the feet of the recently animated corpse touch the ground. The lighting, particularly in the seagrass with its reflections of water, is also highly effective. But we cannot really speak about this movie without speaking about the fog itself. This was created through various technologies, depending on the nature of the fog that they needed. Dry ice created fog that laid very heavily on the ground, for example in the final scene in the church, whilst for the larger sequences, huge industrial foggers powered by gas tanks were brought in to create the fog that we see rolling down the streets. Nowadays, this of course would be done digitally, as it was in the god-awful remake, which I'm not going to mention any further. But in 1980, these effects were all required to be created in camera, and this led to an interesting problem, because, as Carpenter discovered, you can't direct fog. All it took was for the wind to change direction, as it did on numerous occasions, and the scene could have been ruined. As a result, there are several sequences where the fog is actually indeed blowing in the wrong direction, and the film was then shot backwards and reversed in the editing process. This very necessary workaround actually adds to the eerie effect, with the fog behaving in a way that a normal fog bank, or indeed a normal smoke machine, wouldn't normally do. I would imagine to a modern first-time viewer, the effect might appear somewhat hokey, but to me, it adds to the film's charm. And charm is something that this movie really has in spades. And I'm sure this is going to come as no great surprise to any regular listeners, but when it was released in 1980, The Fog did not get a particularly warm critical reception. But if this series is teaching us anything at all, it's that more often than not, critics don't know what the hell they're talking about, and certainly not about films that will make their mark in posterity. Of course, following the cultural phenomenon that was Halloween was always going to be a tall order, and the movie doubtless suffers by comparison. Even Carpenter has called the film a learning experience, and says that after all of the re-editing in post-production, he really doesn't know what it is anymore, although he concedes it is certainly more exciting and more fun than the version that he first screened to test audiences. Financially, though, it did very well, and its initial theatrical run in the US lasted an incredibly impressive 152 weeks. During its fifth week of release, it reached number 1 at the US box office, and earned about $1.6 million that weekend alone, which is not bad going, considering its budget was only $1 million to begin with. Overall, domestically, in the US, it grossed approximately $21.3 million, securing Carpenter a much higher budget of $6 million for his follow-up movie Escape from New York in 1981. He would of course then follow Escape from New York with his version of The Thing, which, as most people now know, sadly was a critical and financial failure, only finding its true audience on home video, and eventually becoming recognised for the classic of science fiction horror that it should have been at the time. And Carpenter continued to have very mixed commercial and critical success with his subsequent movies, which include Christine in 1983, Starman in 1984, Prince of Darkness in 1987, and my particular favourite, In the Mouth of Madness from 1994. His last movie as a director was The Ward in 2010, and whilst he hasn't directed a film in over 15 years, he has expressed a desire to direct again, but only under the right circumstances and with the right budget. More recently, he directed an episode of the Peacock series, John Carpenter's Suburban Screams, which I haven't seen, so I really can't comment on, and now mainly focuses on music and production, including work on the most recent reboots of the Halloween franchise. And whether we see any new films from him or not, he has certainly created a legacy of fantastic movies, some of which we will be returning to over the course of this series. Messiah of Evil and The Fog are both examples of seaside horror, with isolated locations coming under siege from the ghosts of the past. Both, in their own ways, capture not only the spirit of H.P. Lovecraft, but also that of other maritime horror and ghost story writers. Both films also have rather troubled post-production stories, with Carpenter hastily reshooting, re-editing, and rescoring his movie, and Katz and Huck having their work quite literally taken out of their hands and edited by other people. And while both movies might not have ended up in the exact shape that their makers originally intended, they are nevertheless highly enjoyable, in spite of, or possibly maybe because of, the various trials and tribulations. All of which brings me to the end of another very long episode. I swear that I am trying to get the length of these under control, but quite honestly, once I start doing the research, there doesn't seem to be any stopping me. I will try to make next week's a little bit shorter though, but maybe don't hold me to that. And speaking of next week, so far in this series we've explored the horrors of the seaside, the horrors of going on holiday, and the horrors of hanging out with your friends. So I think it's only appropriate that next week we explore the horrors of staying at home. Now, full disclosure, if you're in the UK, both of next week's films are pretty much impossible to watch unless you happen to have a VPN and a subscription to Shudder. So first up next week we have a Spanish psychological thriller from 2011 and director Jaume Balaguero called Sleep Tight, and this features a terrifying performance from the brilliant Spanish actor Luis Tosar. We're then following this with Ils, or Them, a French home invasion movie from 2006, and directors David Moreau and Xavier Palud. So if you're in the UK and you don't have a VPN, you might be able to find them on other online video services. Though, if searching, it might be worth remembering that Sleep Tight was also released under the not very good at all title of Bedtime, so you might find it somewhere under that name. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts about this week's movies, or indeed any of the films we've covered so far in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble. I'd also really appreciate it if you could take just a few seconds to rate, review and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, as it helps a lot more than you know. And all that being said, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion on next week's movies, and in the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.